The first reports were not filed as threats. They were filed as embarrassments, the sort that administrative clerks hate because they force ink to describe something that should not exist. A convoy vanished on the ash roads of Gathhammer's outer manufacture of melt, where the air tasted of metal and prayers turned to grit in the mouth. The escort was standard: a camera, a handful of infantry, a junior engineer, and the machine spirit appeased. Nothing glorious, nothing worth a ballad. The only thing they found afterward was a long black smear across the broken ferrocrete, like a wound that refused to clot. No shell craters, no Lasburin scoring, no sign of a raiding party, just the smear and the stink of promethium, and a single wheel hub, still warm, half melted, as if it had been held in the mouth of a furnace and then placed gently on the ground as an offering. They blamed bandits at first, of course. They always did. The Imperium's frontier worlds were full of desperate men and half-trained militia, and desperation made its own kind of violence. But the pattern was wrong. Bandits stole, bandits bargained, bandits left bodies as warnings. Here, there were no bodies, not even the pious remnants of bones for a priest to bless. The convoy's Vox set was recovered 3 kilometers away, propped upright against a rusted pipe like a shrine. Its casing had been opened with careful hands, the inside stripped and rewired, and the thing had been made to scream a steady pulse into the void. 3 notes, a pause, 3 notes again, until its power cell died. The engineer who examined it grew pale beneath oil-stained skin and whispered that the machine spirit was offended. The priest who stood beside him whispered that something else had listened. More disappearances followed, and the ash roads began to feel narrower. A pilgrim train derailed without impact, its cars peeled open as if a giant hand had pried them apart. A munition hauler rolled into a crater it should have avoided, as if the driver had been blind. And when the crater was searched, there was no driver, only a swatch of leather and the imprint of a hand on the steering column that looked burned into the metal. Fingers spread wide in a final refusal to let go. A patrol from the Planetary Defense Force found a hab stack in the dust that should have been abandoned, but it had lights in the windows and smoke rising from a chimney. Inside, there were plates laid out for a meal that had never been eaten, a child's toy carved from scrap, and walls covered in charcoal marks. The marks were not words, they were not prayers, they were tallies, hundreds of them, cut in furious lines, as if someone had been counting days in a cage. Then came the rumor that turned ordinary fear into religious dread. It began as a murmur among the road crews and the ash scavengers, the men and women who lived far from cathedrals and commissars, who survived by stripping dead machines and selling sacred metal back to the Mechanicus. They spoke of a moving fortress that came at night, a shape of iron and spikes, roaring low like a beast in pain. They said it did not fly, it did not march, it rolled, and its wheels chewed the world. They said it was not one vehicle, but many, bound together with chains and welded plates, a traveling citadel stitched from salvage. They swore it carried a smell of fuel and blood and old storms, and that its engines had a voice, not like a hymn, but like an animal that had learned to hate. Doc and Arbitrator dismissed the tale as hive trash until the first pick capture arrived. The image was grainy, corrupted by static, but it showed a horizon of dust and broken towers under a bruised sky. Something moved there, low and fast, its silhouette jagged, its outline wrong. There was a moment where the pick stabilized, and the viewer could see the front of it, a hood plated with scavenged armor, a grill like bared teeth, and a skull nailed above the engine block. Not an Imperial skull, not a Chaos trophy either. It was older, stranger, the proportions slightly off, as if it belonged to a different breed of man. The pict ended in a burst of white as the recorder's optics shattered from shock or impact. No bodies were recovered from the crew that filmed it, only the camera, found hanging from a chain on a roadside, as if someone had wanted it discovered.
The ecclesiarchy declared it a test. The Mechanicus declared it a malfunction of reality. The local commander declared it a nuisance and ordered a purge patrol. Eager to be the man who solved the problem and earned a line in a report, he sent armored units into the wastes with blessings on their hulls and prayers in their throats. They moved in formation, confident in steel, confident in the Emperor's gaze. Their Vox traffic was calm at first, routine updates, distance checks, fuel consumption. Then the tone changed. A pause, an intake of breath, a single voice that sounded too tight, too dry. Something's out here. The commander demanded clarity. The response came as a hiss of static and a low, steady roar that did not belong to any Imperial engine. Then the Vox went dead. When the patrol failed to return, larger forces were mobilized. A handful of Astra Militarum veterans arrived, grim men with dead eyes who had seen worse than bandits. With them came a black-robed confessor and a small delegation of the Adeptus Mechanicus, their augmentics clicking softly as they walked. They set up a perimeter around the last known coordinates, a stretch of road that cut through ruins like a scar. The air there seemed wrong. Dust hung too still. The wind did not sing through the twisted metal. Even the servitors hesitated, their programmed gait faltering as if their internal compasses had lost meaning. At dusk, the confessor began to chant. The words were old, heavy, meant to anchor souls to the Emperor's light. The soldiers listened with their rifles held tight. The tech priests murmured binaric under their breath, reading data that did not make sense. Somewhere far away, an engine coughed once, like a throat clearing before speech. The sound grew. It did not come from the sky. It came from the road itself, from the darkness beyond the ruin line. It was a growl that became a thunder, a vibration that crawled into bone. The first lights appeared, not clean beams like Imperial searchlights, but the harsh, uneven glare of scavenged illuminators. They bobbed and swayed as if mounted on a beast's head. Shadows moved behind them, tall poles with hanging trophies, chains dragging, metal plates clattering in a rhythm that felt almost deliberate. The veterans raised their weapons. Orders were whispered. Targeting optics flickered. One soldier, too young, too terrified, fired prematurely. The last bolt cut into the dark and vanished, as if the night had teeth. Then the thing came into view. It was not a tank. It was not a transport. It was a predator made of machinery, a war chariot built from desperation and madness, a mass of interlocked vehicles that should never have moved as one. At its heart was a central car, low and brutal, armored with scavenged plating and reinforced with bars like a cage. Around it were attached smaller machines, trailers, bikes, half-smashed trucks, bound by chains, welded beams, and sheer violent intent. The whole construct moved with terrifying purpose, its engines roaring in a discordant choir. On its front was a symbol painted in ash white, a skull split by a vertical line, simple and stark. It was not Imperial. It was not chaos. It was something else, a mark of identity carved into the universe by a man who refused to kneel. Behind the grill, in the driver's seat, a figure sat like a shadow given bones. The optics could not catch his face clearly. Dust and glare blurred him, but they saw enough to know he was human. They saw a ragged silhouette, broad shoulders, a coat flapping like a torn banner. They saw one hand on the wheel, steady, and the other near a weapon that looked too crude to belong in the Imperium, and yet carried the promise of death. They saw something glinting at his wrist, a chain perhaps, or a restraint broken long ago. The confessor shouted the Emperor's name, trying to make the sound a wall. The tech priests screamed in binaric as their auspex arrays spiked with impossible readings. The veterans opened fire in disciplined volleys, red beams stabbing the darkness, striking armor, sparking off metal, cutting into chained trailers. The moving fortress did not slow. If anything, it surged, the roar rising, the lights flaring brighter, as if it fed on resistance. And then the driver looked up. For a brief second, the optics caught his face through the dust. It was not the face of an Imperial citizen raised on catechism and obedience. It was a face carved by sun and starvation, eyes hard and hollow, the gaze of a man who had survived worlds that killed the weak. There was no prayer in that stare, no reverence, only the cold calculation of someone who had learned that hope was a lie and still kept moving. The fortress hit the perimeter like a meteor, metal and chains tearing through barricades. Soldiers were thrown aside. A chimera was lifted on its side by sheer impact, its tracks spinning uselessly. The road became a slaughterhouse of steel and dust, but the thing at the center did not stop. It drove straight through, and in its wake the confessor's chanting cut off mid-verse, as if his throat had been closed by an unseen hand. The veterans tried to regroup, to fall back, to establish a new firing line. Their Vox units sputtered, their Auspex screens went blind. One by one, their lights failed, leaving them in a darkness filled only with the roar of engines and the clatter of chains. In that blackness, a single voice came over the squad channel, low, rough, and undeniably human. It was not a prayer, it was not a threat, it was a statement delivered like a verdict. Keep driving.
The words ended in a burst of static, and the fortress vanished into the ruins, dragging something heavy behind it, something that screamed in mechanical pain as it was pulled away. When dawn came, the perimeter was wreckage. The road was gouged and scarred. Bodies lay where they had fallen, but fewer than expected, as if many had been taken instead of killed. The chimera that had been overturned was gone entirely, as if it had been hauled off as salvage. And on a standing slab of concrete at the edge of the ruined line, someone had painted a new mark in ash white, fresh and bold, a skull, a vertical line, and beneath it a single tally mark, as if to say, 1. The Imperium had finally seen the intruder, and it had not been impressed by their guns or their prayers. Whatever this man was, whatever world had made him, he was not here to negotiate. He was here to endure. And the next convoy was already on the road. The tally mark did more damage than the massacre itself. Bodies could be buried, wreckage could be melted down and sanctified, but symbols had a way of multiplying inside the Imperium's mind. By the time the Administratum authorized the quarantine of the ash roads, the mark had already been copied into slates, sketched into data margins, and whispered between adepts who should have known better. A skull split by a single line, not the Aquila, not the 8-pointed star, something simpler, something stubborn. The kind of sign a man left when he expected the world to keep coming at him and intended to keep meeting it head-on. Orders followed, as they always did, but they arrived late and tangled. Patrols were rerouted, convoys doubled their escorts, Vox discipline was tightened, then loosened again when fear began to choke the channels. The Mechanicus issued a quiet advisory, heavy with qualifiers, about an unidentified mobile construct capable of disrupting machine spirits through unknown means. The Ecclesiasti countered with sermons about endurance and trials, carefully avoiding the word heresy. The veterans who survived the perimeter breach were questioned until their voices went flat, until their memories sounded rehearsed even to themselves. All of them described the same thing, not a charge, not a rout, but a passage, as if the enemy had simply decided to go through them rather than around. Beyond the cordon, the ash roads grew silent. Silence was worse than screams. Scavengers stopped returning. Auspex drones sent out to map the wastes came back blind, their optics sanded smooth, as if they had been dragged face first along the ground for kilometers. One drone returned with its casing split open and its memory core removed with surgical precision, the edges of the cut blackened by heat. The Mechanicus tech priest who examined it said nothing for a long time, then quietly requested additional security for all machine spirits assigned to frontier reconnaissance. He did not explain why. At night, the rumors thickened. Hab workers spoke of engines heard beneath the wind, of vibrations felt through bed frames and prayer benches.
A Mechanicus overseer swore he saw lights moving along the horizon in patterns that made no sense for any known convoy, fast one moment, crawling the next, always circling, always testing. A child claimed a metal man stood outside her window and watched her sleep. The confessor said it was a nightmare and burned incense until the smell drove the girl into coughing fits. When asked to describe the face, she said it looked tired. The Imperium attempted to bait the intruder. A munitions train was sent down a false route, its manifests altered to suggest a shipment too valuable to ignore. The escort was heavier this time, armor plated with extra blessings. Gunners drilled to fire on command rather than instinct. They rolled into the wastes under a sky the color of old bruises, their engines loud with confidence. For a time, nothing happened. Then the Vox picked up a low-frequency interference that made teeth itch. The convoy commander ordered a halt, then changed his mind and ordered full speed. The road ahead buckled upward. It was not an explosion, it was pressure, sudden and overwhelming, as if the world itself had decided to rise up. The lead transport pitched sideways, its wheels shearing off, and the second slammed into it, armor screaming as it tore. From the dust came the roar again, closer now, layered with other sounds, chains snapping taut, metal scraping, engines revving and cutting in a rhythm that felt deliberate, almost patient. The escorts fired into the cloud, lasers carving red scars through nothing. Something hit the flank of the convoy with the weight of a falling building. A trailer lifted, spun, and vanished into the haze. The commander screamed orders that no one could hear. The Vox channel filled with static and a single steady sound beneath it, like breathing. When the dust thinned, the moving fortress emerged piece by piece, its lights stabbing through the murk. The skull mark was there again, repainted cleaner this time, as if someone took pride in maintenance. The central car rolled forward, low and unstoppable. And for a moment, the commander thought he saw hesitation, a pause before the kill. Instead, the moving fortress did something unexpected. It veered. The chained vehicle swung wide, carving a path that missed the command chimera by meters. The convoy's fire slackened in confusion as the intruder drove past, not through. Engines streaming, it tore into the rear transports. Crates burst open, shells spilled on the road, a fuel tank ruptured and turned the dust into flame. Through it all, the central car never slowed. It took what it wanted and kept moving, dragging a captured trailer behind it like a trophy. As it passed the command vehicle, the commander caught a glimpse through his viewport. A man behind the wheel, face set and eyes forward, not looking at the Imperials at all, as if they were just another hazard on a road that had never been kind. When the smoke cleared, the convoy was wreckage and fire, but the command chimera still stood. Its crew sat stunned, alive by accident. On its hull, someone had scratched another tally mark, the line deep and precise. 2.
The aftermath was worse than the attack. The realization spread that this enemy could have destroyed them completely, and had chosen not to. The ecclesiarchy's sermons grew sharper, more insistent, framing survival as mercy that demanded repentance. The Mechanicus quietly recalibrated threat assessments upward. Astra Militarum commanders argued in sealed chambers about whether they were facing a warband, a daemon engine, or something that did not fit any category they had been taught to fear. None of the arguments satisfied, and the whispers began about chaos. Heretics claimed the intruder's engines sang in a way that scraped at the soul. A junior inquisitorial aide suggested carefully that the skull mark might be a blasphemous echo of sacred iconography twisted by the warp. A veteran spat at that and said there was nothing warped about it, that the thing on the road felt solid and hateful in a very human way. The suggestion lingered anyway, because the Imperium preferred its monsters to have names. Chaos was a name. It fit. On the third night after the convoy ambush, a listening post far from the roads picked up a transmission that was neither a broadcast nor a prayer. It was a narrow-band signal, crude and powerful, punching through the static like a fist. The adept strained to isolate it, to translate it, to find some pattern that would let them categorize the threat. There was no code, no cipher, just a loop of sound. Engines revving, metal clashing, and beneath it, a low human voice muttering to itself, words half lost to interference. The only phrase that came through clearly, repeated twice before the signal cut: "Not again." The listening post was destroyed an hour later by something that came out of the dark without warning. There were no survivors to explain how the defenses failed, only wreckage and a familiar mark painted on the tower, fresh against scorched metal. 3. The name spread. By now, the name had spread, not officially, but the way names always spread in the Imperium, through fear and repetition. Mad Max. A label scavenged from fragments, from old data ghosts and half-remembered legends of a man who drove and survived when others did not. The Administratum did not approve it. The Ecclesiarchy did not bless it. The soldiers used it anyway because it fit. The way the engine sounded, the way the attacks came without mercy and without excess, the way the intruder kept moving as if stopping would mean death. Somewhere beyond the cordon, the moving fortress refueled from stolen tanks and stripped wrecks. Its chained vehicles were repaired, reinforced, made uglier and stronger. The man at the center worked in silence, hands black with oil, eyes scanning the horizon even as he tightened bolts and rewired engines. He did not speak to the night. He did not curse the stars. He counted 3 tallies. Imperial escalation. Now the Imperium was mobilizing something larger, something older, drawn by the insult of survival and the audacity of a single man who would not break. They would come with doctrine and fire and certainty. They would come to end the problem. The road stretched ahead, cracked and endless, and the engines roared as the fortress turned towards the glow of distant hive lights, towards the next test allowable placed by fate. The count was not finished, but it was just beginning. By the time the 3rd tally was recorded, the Imperium stopped pretending this was an anomaly. The ash roads were sealed by decree, not because the seal would hold, but because it created the appearance of control. Control mattered. It kept the faith intact. Vox traffic was restricted to burst transmissions. Pilgrimages were rerouted. Entire labor hubs were relocated under the excuse of industrial optimization. Officially, nothing stalked the wastes. Unofficially, every commander knew the truth, that something was moving faster than doctrine, thinking sharper than prediction, and surviving encounters that should have ended it. Unaware that the road ahead had already been measured, already been judged, and somewhere in the roaring heart of the machine, the man counted the turns left before impact, eyes hollow, jaw set, driving not towards victory, but towards survival in a universe that would not stop trying to kill him. The 5th tally was coming, and this time the cost would be impossible to ignore. The 5th tally was never painted. By the time the Imperium understood that omission, it was already too late. Ultimate Strike Force. The Strike Force was everything doctrine promised. Armored regiments deployed in layered formations, artillery batteries positioned on elevated ground, firing lanes calculated to overlap and annihilate anything that dared approach. Thunderbolt squadrons prowled the skies, engines screaming hymns of superiority. Above it all, inquisitorial oversight tightened like a noose. Every order weighed against annihilation protocols that had not been invoked on this world for centuries. The road ahead was no longer a road. It was a corridor of death, sculpted with intent, designed to end whatever madness had crawled out of the wastes. The fortress came anyway. It emerged from the horizon at full speed. No feint, no misdirection. Its silhouette massive now, swollen with stolen armor and chained wreckage. It looked less like a vehicle and more like a moving ruin, a city of scrap dragged screaming across the ash.
Engines roared in layered fury, some imperial, some unknown, all forced into obedience by brutal rewiring and stubborn will. The skull mark was still there, scarred and scorched, but not unbroken. There was no pause this time, no circling, no testing. The man had chosen the road straight through the fire. Bombardment onslaught. Artillery opened first. The sky tore itself apart as shells rained down, turning kilometers of ground into molten hell. Explosions walked towards the fortress in perfect sequence, doctrine made manifest. For a moment, even the veterans believed nothing could survive that kind of attention. Then the smoke cleared in places, and the impossible kept moving. Chained vehicles were obliterated, torn free, and reduced to fragments, but the central mass drove on, shedding weight, adapting in motion. Armor sloughed off in burning sheets, revealing more plating beneath, welded and bolted with no concern for aesthetics, only function. Air support screamed in low, fast passes, cannons stitching fire across the target. One fighter vanished in a blossom of flame as debris was flung skyward by sheer momentum. Another banked too late and clipped a rising plume of smoke and metal, spiraling into the ground. The fortress did not fire back at the sky. It did not need to. It endured. At the heart of the machine, the man braced himself against impacts that would have shattered lesser bodies. His world narrowed to vibration and pressure, to the feedback of the wheel beneath his hands and the road screaming beneath reinforced tires. Blood ran from a cut on his brow, blurring vision he refused to wipe away. He adjusted throttle, angle, timing, driving through fire like it was weather. He had survived worse. Not here in this universe, but the rules were the same. Keep moving or die.
The Imperium's ground forces engaged next. Tanks rolling forward to meet the charge, cannons fired at point-blank range, shells punching into the fortress with concussive force. One struck the central car and tore a crater into its hood, the impact throwing the vehicle sideways. For a heartbeat, it looked like the end. Then the engine screamed, raw and furious, and the fortress righted itself, plowing forward, ramming straight into the lead tank. The collision was catastrophic. Armor buckled, tracks snapped. The tank was lifted and crushed against another, both reduced to screaming wrecks as the fortress forced its way between them. Infantry scattered, disciplined lines breaking as something too large, too relentless, tore through their kill zone. Lasfire stitched uselessly across moving armor. Men died beneath spinning chains and collapsing metal, their screams lost beneath the thunder of vengeance. Inquisitorial command issued the final order. Containment failed, escalation authorized. The sky darkened as orbital assets aligned. The strike would not annihilate the world, but it would break the battlefield, a focused lance, enough to turn the road and everything on it into glass. Coordinates were locked. A countdown began. The fortress drove faster. The man saw the light change, felt the pressure in his bones before the auspex screamed warnings. He knew that feeling. He had felt it on another dying world under a sun that had burned too bright, too long. He had seconds. He aimed not for escape, but for impact. The lance struck. The world became white fire. The road vanished. The battlefield ceased to exist. Everything within kilometers was reduced to molten ruin, a wound carved into the planet's surface. Tanks vaporized, men erased, the fortress swallowed whole. Its roar cut off mid-scream as fire and force consumed it. Silence followed. Imperial commanders exhaled, faith restored in the language of finality. Whatever that thing had been, it was gone. The tally would end at 4. Then the auspex reading spiked. From the center of the glass crater, something moved, not intact, not whole, but moving. A shape dragged itself free of the molten ruin, engines coughing, metal warped and broken, chains trailing like entrails. The fortress was ruined, reduced to a skeletal core of its former mass, but the central car still lived, its engine screaming in agony and refusal. Armor hung loose, burning, wheels cracked, grinding against glass. It should not have moved. It did anyway.
The man drove it out of the crater on instinct and rage, every motion costing blood and breath. Systems failed around him, fuel leaked, the engine screamed a death song that matched his own pulse. He did not look back at the destruction. There was no victory there, only proof that stopping was death. Imperial forces froze, caught between awe and terror. They had spent everything. There was nothing left to throw. The vehicle ground to a halt at the edge of the ruined road, finally, reluctantly stopping. Smoke poured from its wounds. Fire licked at shattered plating. For the first time since his arrival, the man let the engine idle down. He stepped out onto the glass earth, boots cracking the surface beneath him. He stood alone, silhouetted against a battlefield erased by the Imperium's own hand. Bolters were raised, orders were shouted, none were carried out. The man looked at the ruin, at the dead machines, at the men who stared at him through scopes in fear. His face was burned, bloodied, but his eyes were clear. He reached into the wreckage behind him, tore free a scorched plate of armor, and dragged it upright. With shaking hands, he painted the mark again in ash and soot scavenged from the dead world beneath his feet. A skull, a vertical line, 5 tallies. Then he turned back to the machine, climbed inside, and restarted the engine with a sound like a wounded animal refusing to lie down. The vehicle lurched forward, limping but alive, disappearing into the smoke before the Imperium found the courage to fire again. The galaxy had tried to erase him. It had failed. But the cost was written across a world that would never heal, and the road ahead promised nothing but worse. The end was coming, not as victory, but as survival paid in blood. The world was declared spiritually compromised within the hour. The Inquisition did not argue about whether the decision was justified. They argued only about timing. A planet that had endured orbital sanction and still failed to erase a single intruder was not a symbol the Imperium could afford to leave standing. Faith depended on inevitability. What could not be crushed had to be buried, its memory fragmented, its lessons diluted into classified reports and censored prayers. Orders were issued to begin population relocation under the language of mercy, followed by sterilization protocols disguised as purification. The road would be sealed forever. The tally marks would be erased. The story would end on paper, even if it had not ended in reality. But the road did not care about decrees. Far beyond the glass battlefield, the machine limped through ruins that had never known imperial banners. Its engines coughed, stalled, then roared again, fueled scavenged from dead tanks and broken depots. What remained of the fortress was smaller now, stripped to brutal essentials. No excess chains, no trophies dragged for intimidation, only armor where it mattered, reinforcement where failure meant death. The man had adapted again, cutting away weakness without sentiment. He always did. He drove until the pain blurred into something distant, until the world narrowed to vibration and heat and the steady pull of forward motion. When the engine finally died, it did so without drama, choking once before silence fell like a verdict. He sat there for a long time, hands still on the wheel, listening to the cooling metal tick and sigh around him. Stopping always hurt. Stopping meant remembering.
He did not sleep. He worked with hands burned and shaking. He tore into the machine, replacing parts with whatever the road offered, a cogitator core ripped from a wrecked chimera, fuel lines welded from mismatched alloys, armor plates cut down and bolted with uneven force. The machine spirit screamed at first, rejecting the indignity of such treatment, but he forced it into obedience the way he forced everything else, by refusing to give it a choice. In the end, the engine turned over again, weaker than before, but alive. Emerging shadows. That was when the whispers found him. Not voices, not warp-mad hallucinations, but patterns, movements in the distance that mirrored his own, shapes that watched from ruins and withdrew when he advanced.
Cultists had followed the road like parasites, drawn by destruction and myth. They had built shrines from scrap, painted his mark in blood, twisted endurance into worship. He destroyed them without ceremony. Vehicles crushed, bodies scattered, shrines ground into dust beneath spinning wheels. He did not allow gods on his road, not new ones, not old ones. The Imperium tried again, more quietly this time. Kill teams were deployed ahead of his projected path, elite units trained to erase problems without witnesses. They laid traps not meant to stop a vehicle, but to stop a man. Ambushes timed for refueling, snipers positioned to take a headshot when he slowed, saboteurs sent to poison fuel reserves and collapse tunnels he might use for shelter. It worked once. A charge detonated beneath the road and flipped the machine onto its side, snapping an axle and shattering plating. The man was thrown clear, ribs cracking, vision swimming. They closed in with professional precision. He killed them anyway, not with heroics, not with fury, but with the same cold economy he had always used. He dragged himself back to the wreck, used its mass as cover, baited them into firing lanes, and turned their discipline against them. When it was over, he rebuilt again. Slower this time, each movement costing more than the last. The machine rolled forward on damaged wheels, leaving a scar of metal and oil behind it, like a trail of blood. Fading echoes. Reports of his survival were downgraded, then redacted. The Inquisition did not want another world to learn the wrong lesson. Chaos warbands began to take notice as well, drawn by the echo of defiance rather than allegiance. They expected a champion. They found a man who did not kneel, who did not answer challenges, who drove straight through their lines and left them broken in his wake. Some tried to follow. None kept up. The truth became unavoidable. The intruder was not growing stronger. He was wearing out. Every repair was cruder. Every engine restart took longer. His body bore the cost in fractures that never healed, burns that reopened, exhaustion that no amount of motion could outrun. The road had taught him how to survive, not how to endure forever. The galaxy was too large, too hostile, too eager to grind everything down. The Imperium sensed it. Chaos sensed it. Predators always knew when something bled. Inevitable endgame. The final escalation was prepared without ceremony, an interdiction across the entire region. No convoys, no civilians, no witnesses. A net of overlapping kill zones supported by orbital assets, calibrated to fire in sequence until nothing mobile remained. Not one strike, many, enough to guarantee exhaustion would finally claim what fire could not. The operation did not have a name. Names gave things weight. The road narrowed ahead, funneling the machine toward a corridor of ruin and shadow. The man felt it in his bones. He had felt it before, standing beneath another dying sky, knowing the end was not something you escaped, only something you chose how to meet. He adjusted his course anyway. There was no other direction. Engines screamed as the first strikes hit the horizon, explosions walking toward him like patient hunters. The machine shuddered, shedding parts with every impact. One wheel tore free and vanished in flame. Another locked, forcing him to drag it along in a shower of sparks. Fire washed over the hood, blistering paint and burning away the skull mark until only scorched metal remained. Still he drove. The final blow did not come from the sky. It came from the road. A massive collapse triggered beneath him, the ground giving way into a chasm carved by previous bombardments. The machine plunged, crashing into darkness, metal tearing, engines screaming once before silence swallowed it. Fire followed, then dust, then nothing.
When the smoke cleared hours later,
There was no movement, no engine noise, no lights. Imperial Auspex readings showed only wreckage at the bottom of the newly formed abyss, crushed and broken beyond recovery. The Inquisition marked the target as neutralized, the operation as a success. Orders were issued to erase remaining symbols, to burn any record that suggested a single man had challenged the Imperium and endured. They did not send recovery teams. They did not paint a tally. Deep in the chasm, beneath layers of broken metal and collapsed stone, something still ticked as it cooled. A hand lay on a shattered steering wheel, fingers curled, refusing to open even in unconsciousness. The engine was dead. The road was gone. For the first time since arriving in this galaxy, the man was still. Whether that stillness was an end or only another pause, the Imperium would not know, and the road, patient as ever, waited. The Imperium called it closure. Official records marked the Ash World as pacified, its surface rendered inert by necessary force, its anomalies erased by righteous application of fire and silence. The road networks were declared non-functional. The ruins were sealed beneath layers of vitrified earth and classified reports. The name that had spread in whispers was scrubbed from data crypts, reduced to corrupted fragments and administrative errors. No statue was raised, no victory hymn was sung. The absence itself was meant to be the proof. But the galaxy does not forget simply because the Imperium commands it to. In the months that followed, trade routes across nearby systems began to change. Convoys rerouted without clear reason, captains citing mechanical unease, ghosts, a sense that certain paths were wrong in ways charts could not explain. Engines failed more often on straight, obedient routes, while battered ships limped successfully through passages long considered cursed. Machine spirits grew stubborn, resistant to ritual, responding only after long cycles of strain and correction. Tech priests noted the pattern and refused to discuss it openly. On distant worlds, far from the glass crater and the sealed road, symbols began to appear. Not cult shrines, not heretical icons, simple marks scratched into bulkheads and hab walls by laborers and voidsmen who could not explain why their hands moved. A skull, a vertical line, no tallies, just the mark itself, crude and unfinished, as if the count had been interrupted and never resumed. The ecclesiarchy condemned them as superstition and ordered them burned away. They returned anyway, repainted after purges, etched deeper after every cleansing. Chaos took notice and found nothing it could claim. Its seers searched the immaterium for echoes of power and found only absence, a gap where a presence should have been. No demon whispered his name, no god reached out. The road warrior did not haunt the warp. He did not ascend, he did not become a legend fed by belief. That absence unsettled even the servants of ruin. There was no corruption to exploit, no soul screaming for meaning, only motion abruptly denied. In the sealed abyss beneath the Ash World, the wreck remained. Recovery was deemed unnecessary, then impossible, then forbidden. Auspex scans occasionally returned faint anomalies, thermal ghosts, pressure shifts, vibrations that suggested settling stone. Each was explained away. The Inquisition preferred their dead unquestionable. Still, once every few decades, the sensors recorded something else, a brief spike, like a heartbeat, followed by nothing. No engine roar, no movement, just a reminder that certainty was a fragile thing. The universe moved on as it always did. Wars raged, worlds burned, empires clashed and collapsed under their own weight. The Imperium endured by grinding everything beneath it, convinced that motion without obedience was heresy. Yet something had changed, subtle and corrosive. In battle reports, commanders noted enemies that refused to break, even when annihilation was assured. In hive slums and void decks, men and women spoke of survival not as faith, but as refusal. Keep moving, don't stop, don't kneel. Words stripped of theology, heavy with exhaustion. No one could trace where the idea came from. On one distant forge world, a damaged transport was found abandoned at the edge of a manufacturing district. Its engine was cold, its hull scarred beyond reason. It bore no sigils of allegiance, no registration marks. The tech priests who examined it could not identify half of its modifications, could not reconcile how it had functioned at all. On its hood, barely visible beneath layers of grime, was a familiar shape scratched rather than painted. A skull, a vertical line. No tally followed. The transport was dismantled, its components recycled, its mystery erased for efficiency's sake. Yet afterwards, the machines built from its parts behaved strangely. They resisted shutdown. They performed beyond tolerance. They failed catastrophically when forced to halt mid-operation. The forge logged the losses and blamed faulty rights. Somewhere, far beyond any charted road, beneath layers of dead world and forgotten fire, a man lay broken inside a machine that could no longer answer him. His body was ruined, his breath shallow. Pain dulled into something distant and constant. There was no strength left to drive, no road left to follow. The universe had finally caught up. And still, his hand did not release the wheel. The giants belonged only to gods had been shown a different truth, that survival did not require blessing, that motion itself could be defiance, that even in a galaxy built on eternal war, a single human refusal could scar reality without ever winning. The road ended, the idea did not, and that was the tragedy the Imperium could never fully erase.